Welcome to the Mondowise podcast. My name is Khadr Jabbar. In just a week, Israel's brutal bombing campaign on Lebanon has killed more than 700 Lebanese people and displaced over 90,000, escalating tensions with Hezbollah and pushing the conflict closer to what some believe is already an all-out war. This comes on the heels of the recent pager attack, where hundreds of personal electronic devices were booby-trapped by Israel, resulting in the deaths and injuries of hundreds of people across the country. Today, I'm joined by Abboud Hamayel, a writer, analyst, and lecturer in the Department of Arabic Language and Literature at Birzeit University. We'll be discussing the recent Israeli attacks on Lebanon, the potential implications for the region, and how these developments impact Gaza. Welcome, Abboud, to the Mondowise podcast. Thank you for joining me.
Thanks for having me, Khadr.
Abboud, let's start off with Israel's actions in Lebanon. For the past week, Israel's been waging a brutal bombing campaign on Lebanon. More than 700 Lebanese have been killed. This comes almost a week after the Lebanese pager attack, where hundreds of personal electronic devices were booby-trapped by Israel and exploded across the country, killing hundreds of people and wounding thousands. What is the latest news in Lebanon, and what are the latest updates?
Well, thanks, Khadr. So since at least 2 weeks, we've been seeing Israel moving upwards in the escalation ladder in its northern borders, specifically with the Lebanese resistance and more specifically with Hezbollah. And it has conducted various forms of operations using some of its intelligence gathering in the past 17 years or so since the 2006 war, and its knowledge of Hezbollah, and it's able to penetrate some of its communication devices to create what is called in military language a military shock or a system shock in enemy forces. And to do that, it showed its capability of blowing up the pagers on last Tuesday, and then blowing up also some of the walkie-talkies that some of the members of the Lebanese resistance uses. Of course, it's important to note that a lot of these pagers and walkie-talkies are also used by civilians or are used by the wider Lebanese social base from which Hezbollah is drawn, and therefore there was a lot of also civilian casualties since these devices exploded in homes, in markets, and in different locations. And it was aptly described as a terror attack because it did not really differentiate between military personnel and civilians in Lebanon more broadly. After conducting these two massive attacks that attempted to paralyze Hezbollah, it also moved or continued with its approach to assassinating leadership, including a bombing of a meeting that was taking place between some of Hezbollah's leadership in Al-Dahi and Beirut, and killing around 12 of those leaders, including one of its main commanders, or one of the main commanders of the Hezbollah military forces. So we can say from a military standpoint that these attacks were meant, first of all, to extract the price from Hezbollah. They're an escalation in the escalation ladder, and it was meant to create a system shock to loosen Hezbollah's confidence in itself as a fighting force, to create problems of trust in terms of the communication networks that the Hezbollah forces are using, and also to deprive Hezbollah of some of its key leadership or key leaders. And then, after it conducted all of these forms of attack, Israel has also moved to a wide-scale bombing campaign, one of the highest and most intensive bombing campaigns that the Israeli Air Force has ever conducted in its history. And it's targeting Lebanese homes across villages in the south, and now even in the north, and in Al-Beqa' Valley, and in other areas across Lebanon. And has continued to approach the war by attempting to assassinate some of the key leaders in Hezbollah's military forces, more broadly. So this is the Israeli approach thus far: wide aerial bombardment campaign, a system shock to the resistance. But despite the operational success, and even Hassan Nasrallah, the leader or the Secretary General of Hezbollah, has acknowledged that these were painful attacks by Israel on Hezbollah military force and capability. However, the current paradigm does not mean that these operational successes will translate easily into a strategic success, which is what the rationale behind this intensifying escalation campaign is, which is to try to decouple the Lebanese or Northern Palestine front from the ongoing genocidal war in the Gaza Strip. So thus far, we have seen that Hezbollah has remained calm, has been able to conduct also an escalation in the use of its rocket firepower, whether in terms of what areas it actually targets inside historic Palestine. And for now, it has limited itself mostly to the northern part of historical Palestine, which is the Al Jalil or the Galilee area, from areas like Nazareth and Akka and Haifa and others that are being now part of the daily routine of rocket fire into Palestine by Hezbollah and the Lebanese resistance more broadly, or by using some of its more precise or high quality or precision rockets, but slowly and steadily increasing the tempo of attacks in a very measured manner, which shows that Hezbollah has maintained command and control, has maintained its ability to fight, still has a lot of capability, and still most of its actual capability has not been used throughout this military campaign. So what we have now is a trading of blows. Of course, within this paradigm, Israel is committing more atrocities, killing more civilians, targeting more of the civic space in Lebanon, while Hezbollah is largely actually confining itself into military targets, whether it's military bases or some of the industrial infrastructure around Israel's military system and its military capability.
And Abboud, as you pointed out, that Hezbollah's response has been relatively calm and measured compared to Israel's bombing campaign, which is the bloodiest since 2006, the last time Israel was bombing Lebanon. In your opinion, how much of Israel's attacks on Hezbollah and Lebanon is to provoke Hezbollah into a greater response and to accelerate this regional war that Netanyahu seems really keen on having?
Well, I think from the outset of this campaign, Israel is looking for a highly intensive, highly short form of warfare. It does not want this war to continue with Hezbollah endlessly, meaning that what it's trying to do is a coercion policy. And by intensifying its campaign and getting Hezbollah also to intensify its firepower, it can get into a point where each actor, in this case, would want to resolve issues quite quickly, and therefore would reach a strategic stalemate that would actually enable a diplomatic resolution to happen without Gaza being considered. And I think Hezbollah, what it has been trying or attempting to do, is to show that it's capable of swallowing up a lot of the Israeli attacks. Some of them were surprising and shocking, but at the same time, continuing with its policy of attritional warfare without reaching the threshold of a complete war, which would serve, a fast diplomatic solution coming about. And therefore, Israel is still in a bind. Of course, it has increased its intensity. Part of the advantage of being in Israel's position now is that it can test the limits of Hezbollah, what it can hit, how much it can hit, how much it can kill, to what extent it can provoke or extract a price from Hezbollah's social base, civic space, its military organizational capacity, whether it's in infrastructure, whether it's in personnel, and not get into a complete warfare. And also Israel is at some level afraid of going into an all-out war, which could cause a lot of havoc within Israel itself if Israel uses its entire rocket arsenal and its ability or firepower targeting strategic infrastructure or the civic space within Israel, or some of its more advanced economic infrastructure in the north or in the center. So there's still that give and take in this scenario, but Israel is now increasing and heightening up the pressure, and what we have seen is that Hezbollah has been able to maintain this kind of measured response, which is largely targeting or largely meant to make Israel's strategic objective, which is to decouple Lebanon from Palestine, a failure. And to this extent, until this moment, until we're speaking, Israel is failing on these terms.
We've seen Israel's rhetoric regarding Lebanon and Hezbollah has been very similar to what it's been saying about Gaza. They make no difference between Lebanese people and Hezbollah fighters, claiming weapons are being stored in civilian homes, telling people to flee before civilian areas are bombed. How much of the Gaza genocidal playbook are you seeing? Playing out in Lebanon?
Well, I mean, I think what's important is not only the playbook itself. So, replicating a similar rhetorical or discursive stance. It's important to understand where these, how does the character of Israel fighting come about? And I think what is important for people to understand here is that Israel is a army that practices post-heroic form of warfare, post-heroic forms of warfare. So it relies heavily on standoff firepower. It relies heavily on air power, and it does not want to risk its soldiers. And to the extent possible, it wants to unleash that firepower and maintain and sustain its military forces and its capacity to fight throughout time, and not also sacrifice many of its soldiers. So its claims in Gaza, I mean, what we've seen in Gaza partially, I mean, yeah, of course, Israel wants to change the paradigm of the relationship with the Palestinians, committing genocide, ethnic cleansing, ensuring that October 7th, as a moment of the possibility for liberation arising and interplaying in the political field in the Middle East, but also in the world more broadly, is killed through this kind of brutal, monstrous policy that Israel has been used. But it's also that Israel is incapable of fighting a war where its soldiers are placed in high risk situations. It cannot sustain a campaign where its soldiers will actually enter homes and find these or enter areas where they would find these weapons. Of course, a lot of these claims that Israel has been, throwing out there, nobody can actually confirm. I mean, there's no real, when they entered Shifa, they said there's a high complex military command under a Shifa hospital in Gaza. Then we found out there's nothing. So a lot of these claims are just made to justify what it sees as an important and weak area in resistance movements more broadly, which is the civilian or the social space that bequeaths the resistance in the first place. So by targeting homes, by targeting families, by killing people, by extracting a bloody price, it hopes that this society will pressure resistance movements, the more organized forces in society, to give up on the fight. That's the paradigm of thinking in Israel's military parlance, and it has nothing to do with military or rockets being placed in homes. I don't think that that's happening in villages in Lebanon, and Israel has not shown any proof that it's happening in any significant way to actually justify any form of wide-scale military aerial bombardment against civilian homes. So at this moment, we can't take Israeli claims with any seriousness. I mean, I think it's just a policy meant to target the civilian population, to extract the price from the civilian population and pressure Hezbollah into giving up on its front, backing up and trying to prevent this genocidal war in Gaza from continuing. That's the basic form, and of course it's reinforced again with basically Israeli cowardness. It's it doesn't want to enter the tunnels in Gaza and actually fight within the tunnels. It doesn't want to, encounter Palestinian resistance forces face to face. It uses armored vehicles and air power, and then clears out entire areas, bombing entire neighborhoods, rendering Gaza as a rubble, and then at the same time enter after the fact, and do tactical maneuvers that have no real purpose in terms of any war effort. So What we have seen is basically a punishment campaign, whether in Gaza or now in Lebanon. And the military logic of this campaign is more a symptom, an ailment of how a modern contemporary Western society fights wars from a distance.
Israel's rogue behavior in Gaza and what we're seeing right now in Lebanon wouldn't be possible without the U.S. unconditional support for Israel. Many experts have called the U.S. approach a disastrous failure of policy. In what ways has the U.S. failed to de escalate the situation or hold Israel accountable both in Gaza and in Lebanon?
Well, one of the things here is that nobody really knows what the Americans want. Do they want to just contain the war but allow it to continue endlessly? Do they want to give Israel a maneuvering space to extract a price from Hezbollah, from Hamas, from all of these different groups challenging Israel at this current moment, or do they want to end the war? I mean, it's very difficult to actually extract a consistent policy from the Americans. On the one hand, they claim that they want a ceasefire. On the other hand, they hold the keys to stopping the war by stopping the flow of arms coming from America's industrial base into Israel. Without these flow of grenades and bombs and rockets that are being supplied to Israel endlessly, Israel would have a hard time fighting a war on these multi fronts, and would have a hard time with, using its air power in the way it's using it. It would have a hard time challenging all of these forces at once, and therefore, America has a lot of leverage. Unlike what it says, I mean, it says that it doesn't have a leverage, that it's incapable of actually stopping the war, which is, factually and objectively completely untrue. I think that America at some level sees that Israel's willingness to fight, willingness to continue with this war could play to its advantage as long as that war does not harm its vital interests in the Middle East or lead to an all-out war regionally. So as long as the war remains within confined limits and Israel is capable through its intelligence and air power and precise targeting and imprecise targeting as well, to extract prices from these resistances and pressuring them more broadly and weakening them in many ways, America will just simply attempt to manage that war from being expanded more broadly. The other problem is that that's one level of thinking about it. The second level of thinking about it is that America is actually supporting an Israeli policy of a slow escalating war that will actually eventually haunt even Iran itself or Iraq and Syria and other areas. So that you moved from Gaza, you've managed to come with some results in terms of destroying Gaza for a long time to come, rendering it as a rebel, pressuring the society there, depriving the resistance from a lot of its capabilities as well. Now you're moving to Lebanon and perhaps trying to emulate the same scenario. Then you move to other areas and eventually even weakening or having a military solution with Iran itself. And I think as long as this war continues, the possibilities exist for both. And this is what important for people to understand, is that there should be no certainty in our thinking about war. War in itself provides a lot of opportunities, but also as actors, attempt or practice their power, they might grow more confident, they might grow less confident, and by growing more confident, they could make a lot of mistakes in assessment, and by growing less confident, they might retreat when they shouldn't retreat. There are things in war that is highly unpredictable. War is foggy by its very nature, and therefore, Israel now has operational elements, and the past 2 weeks it has gained some confidence in its military capabilities. Now it could take these military capabilities or these successes as a sign of its ability to come out victorious in a decisive way against all of these forces, maybe making mistakes along the ways and actually paying a heavier price by misreading what is the nature of the success that it had. So I think that it remains uncertain what American policy is, but what we can say for certain is that there's no real will to
No,
end the
I've
war in
heard you
Gaza
say, and I've heard other
or
people
in
say
Lebanon.
that Israel keeps pushing the brink to a full-out war. What's not to say that this isn't currently a full-out war, and what in your eyes would need to happen for it to be labeled as such? And then also, how can we not, from what Israel has done the past couple of days, past couple of weeks in Lebanon, how can things even get to a level of de-escalation?
Well, I think on your first question, I think that when we talk about all-out war, is that there's that level of, for instance, when it comes to Lebanon, at least some sort of a ground maneuver by Israeli ground forces into the southern Lebanese towns, or wherever they would reach. There would be the use more of the capabilities that both parties have. I mean, even with this brutal bombing that Israel has committed and conducted in Lebanon, it still has not targeted, a lot of the civilian infrastructure in Lebanon itself, or it has not targeted Beirut extensively. So there is still this kind of, equation being played out between Hezbollah and Israel on some level. Of course, it could change any moment, and we could see that Israel is bombing more extensively Beirut, and Hezbollah is bombing more extensively Tel Aviv, or using more of its firepower and its rockets. But at this moment, this is just a next level of a more intense campaign. Again, I think that Hezbollah is trying as much as possible to keep this war measured, playing it out on the long term, while Israel is trying as much as possible to use the intensity of its abilities in order to pressure Hezbollah into a corner and agreeing to decouple from the war in Gaza, and Hezbollah's attempt, or the Lebanese resistance's more broadly attempt to stop the genocidal war in Gaza. Now, having said that, I think that the problem of defining the type of war that we're in is, a hallmark of this form of hybrid form of warfare that we're living in. And it's not, a war between two equally equipped forces, and it's not a war between two, countries with armies that are regular. This is a war between resistance forces that use a mix of tactics and operational abilities, and a war with an established state, with an established army that also uses a mix of tactics and abilities, each with its own alliance system, each with its own investment in military capabilities and weapons system, each with advantages and disadvantages, each with its own system, which has weaknesses and strengths. So, in many ways, the nature of the war and how it's interplaying, or how it's playing out, has to do with also the character of each of the fighting forces that we have on our hands. So there's this kind of low intensity, high intensity, medium intensity, and maybe also an ability to move between these intensities at various points. There is, each actor is thinking of an economy of how it uses its weapons, and to get and extract as much as possible, political goals from this war. And at the same time, there is also a fear that an all-out war will be costly on everyone, and that's what's important, is that a more regional all-out war means a lot of bad news for the global economy. Its recovery means a lot of bad news for anybody in American politics, running for elections. It's a bad news for inflation. It's a bad news for people's pockets on everyday life in New York or Pennsylvania or London or anywhere else in the world. So there's a lot of fear around an all-out war, but at the same time we're still playing within a specific set of give and take between these forces and what they can actually produce in terms of costs on the other. And I think this will continue. There's an escalation ladder that I don't think is exhausted by just one step more or another step more. There's a lot of steps before we get into a more open, everybody using whatever they have in their capabilities against the other.
Yeah. Now, we've seen Israel act with impunity in the West Bank and in the Gaza Strip. The Gaza Health Ministry has said more than 41,000 Palestinians in Gaza have been killed so far in this past year. Some estimates, like the Lancet Medical Journal, have said that number could be as high as 180,000 Palestinians being killed. with attention now shifting slightly to Lebanon and seeing what might play out there, what do you see is going to happen in Gaza in the West Bank? I mean, Israel's still bombing Gaza. There's still a genocide going on. Recently, Israel closed down Al Jazeera's office inside the West Bank. Now, with the global attention on Lebanon, do you see Israel um, actions being even more heinous, more atrocious in Gaza and the West Bank?
Yeah, I mean, look, sometimes when Israel has or the attention is directed on a a specific front, it might get away with doing things in another context. And during the war on Gaza, for instance, the settlers and the settler-led government of Israel used that opportunity to annex more land, build more settlements, organize and take over Palestinian homes, and also, unleashing the killing machine also in the West Bank, but in a more managed manner, at least until now. Now, the war with Lebanon at this specific moment does direct the attention rightfully to Lebanon because of the intense aerial bombardment, the potential for all-out war, and the repercussions on Lebanon and its people at this very difficult and painful moment for a lot of people, including us in Palestine, who look at the horror that is happening in Lebanon, and and feel for every person who's sacrificing either his home or welfare or his family in support of Palestine and in support of this noble cause. But having said that, I think that at this current moment, while Israel is conducting a lot of its military operations in the north, it's already overextended in many ways militarily. It will need to divert a lot of resources in order to fight a highly complex war. Hezbollah is not in any way Hamas in terms of the types of weapon it has, the type of strategic depth it has, the type of alliance system it also has, and the character of that alliance system when it comes to Hezbollah, Iran, and other forces in the region. So it will have to divert a lot of resources, and it cannot risk, things escalating also in the West Bank in ways that will, extend it even more. So I think on a military level, I don't think at this moment Israel will be, being very aggressive in the West Bank or risking, an intifada, a full-blown intifada to happen. It will, as much as possible, do what is very necessary, make its presence felt, specifically in the north of the West Bank, conducting operations arrest, making people feel that they're still on top of things, but at the same time, as much as possible, trying its best for the West Bank not to blow up in their faces at the moment that they're fighting in Lebanon, a highly complex enemy in their eyes.
And Abboud, could you talk a little bit about how the internal political situation is in Israel, including Netanyahu's leadership and his, right-wing coalition partners, influence its military strategy in both Gaza and Lebanon? And what is your sense of the general Israeli public? Do they want a war with Lebanon?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think they do. I mean, I think that what they want is not the war; they want the victory, and these are two different set of things. No, it's not war for war's sakes, but it's a yearning for ultimate form of security that October 7th proved is impossible. We shouldn't underestimate October 7th on Israeli psyche. It opened a wound. It reignited the question of the settler in Palestine and his existential anxiety over his ability to continue to be in Palestine. It placed him in a hard place in terms of, should I persevere here? Should I fight? Should I remain? Or should I flee? I mean, of course, I'm maybe exaggerating in some level, but that's the contours of how Israel viewed October 7th, not because it was really an existential risk on it. I mean, we already saw that in only 2 or 4 days, Israel was able to regain the Gaza envelope and the settlements surrounding Gaza. So there was no real risk of the Palestinian resistance invading and taking over Palestine 1948 and continuing with its military maneuver deep within Israeli territory. But what is, I think, important is that on the level of the psyche, that's how it felt for most Israelis. And Israelis, they want to regain the initiative. They saw October 7th as an opportunity to extract a price from everybody in the region that supports resistance and resistance forces. They want to destroy societies that are, challenging them, whether in Gaza or Lebanon or other places. And at the minimum, they think that they will gain more time remaining in Palestine by extracting this heavy price from everybody. And in the maximum, the real desire is for an ultimate form of victory, this kind of awe-inspiring victory that will give them a sense of answer for their existential question of robbing other people's houses and homes in Palestine and taking them over, and still living within the confines of this kind of ghettoized state that thinks it's always under siege and that fights with all its power to remain. So I think that on some level, the Israelis want the war, they want a victory, they want to create these awe-inspiring moments that, like we saw with the pager and walkie-talkie attacks, which they have severely missed. I mean, again, let's contrast October 7th with Israel's action after October 7th. October 7th was a surprise maneuver. Israel was caught with its pants down. Its entire military command in the south fell down. Its soldiers didn't fight back. It looked weak. It looked frail. And there's that moment that, has stuck in Israeli psyche, but also in Palestinian psyche as well. And since then, Israel has been conducting forms of operation that, inspire shock and horror, but they don't inspire a lot of awe, and don't give Israeli this taste of power that, Israeli identity was actually built on. And with Hezbollah, we've seen this awe factor come back again, like penetrating the communication devices and blowing them at once. In some of the operations that Israel has conducted in Gaza as well, perhaps extracting some of the Israeli prisoners held by the Palestinian resistance. So the Israelis want both these kind of operational awe moments. They want the war to regain a sense of security with themselves before gaining it in the eyes of their enemies. I mean, this is what also is important about this war. It's about, an Israeli breakdown, or, in the psyche that needs to always have, more to reassert its power more and more. So it realizes back again that it's more powerful than all of its enemies. So there's that psychic element that pushes for perpetual war. That's on a level of, if you want, psychological and aesthetic also analysis. But on a political level, Israel finds this as an opportunity. It's already way deep in a war for 11 months, a war that it's costing it a lot economically, socially, politically, diplomatically, in terms of perceptions around what Israel is in the world. And it sees itself that only more war will bring out better results politically, diplomatically, and otherwise, that it will be able to reassert power in the region. It will be able to establish what it calls deterrence. It will be able to, put a line in the sand in terms of, you ever challenge us again, this is what will happen to you. It will burn into the peoples in the region's consciousness that Israel is not an actor that should be played with. So all of these motivations are coexistence all at once in Israel's, conduct. And of course, for the settlers specifically, the only ones that have a real solution for this whole Palestinian question, which is, instead of managing the conflict or shrinking the conflict or destroying the possibilities for two states or one state solution or diplomatic or political language, what the settlers say is that what we should change in the paradigm with the Palestinians is to destroy the Palestinian existence on the land of Palestine. So for the settlers, they see ultimate victory as one that completely shifts the ground under the 5 million, or to be more accurate, the 7 million to 8 million Palestinians that exist between the river and the sea, including Palestinian citizens of Israel, and to get rid as many as possible of those Palestinians, and to establish this kind of pure religious Jewish state that they dream of. And I think that, for them, war is desirable. It maintains the possibility for ethnic cleansing. It maintains the possibility for genocide, and it maintains the possibility for things going in the direction in which they believe they will come out triumphant and end and for all the whole Palestinian question. Of course, even in their wildest dreams, I don't think that even if they clear out all of Palestine from Palestinians, that the Palestinian question will go away.
Yeah, I want to touch a little bit more on what you said about the Israeli psyche and this kind of idea of total victory. This kind of grand victory would obviously come at a huge cost for Palestinians, for Lebanese, for anybody in the region, because at the end of the day, Israel is a settler colonial state and looking to constantly expand its presence and constantly shut down any type of form of resistance, whether it's Hamas, Hezbollah, Ansar Allah, any Iran, any kind of actors that would pose any kind of threat. And as you were talking, I was thinking about how Israel constantly leaks images of violent acts they've done to Palestinian prisoners. Obviously, the stories of them raping Palestinian prisoners. All of this I think, to obviously dehumanize Palestinians, but to break our psyche. And as you put it, October 7th broke the security psyche that Israelis had about themselves and about the state of Israel. But I'm curious, from your perspective, someone in the West Bank, how has the resistance psyche for Palestinians changed and evolved since October 7th?
Well, I mean, look, first of all, I mean, it's when somebody who thinks himself as invincible at some point feels very vulnerable. And, Israeli identity vacillates between these two conditions, between presenting itself as the ultimate victim coming from Jewish history and continuing with this kind of mentality that they're the perpetual victim, historically speaking, and even in the contemporary era. And by also, using that victimhood and this injury, this historical injury, to displace it onto Palestinians and deprive Palestinians from life, liberty, and the pursuit of self-determination or any other form of a life without military occupation and brutality. So the Israelis have that mentality, and October 7th kind of, peeled the iron wall that Israel surrounds itself with. And this iron wall that is materially existence in terms of the architecture that surrounds Gaza and besiege it, but also an ideological iron wall of invincibility that was actually built in with the Zionist movement from its inception through the writings, for instance, of Ze'ev Jabotinsky, who was the head of or the leader of the revisionist Zionist movement in the 1920s and 30s. And he wrote about this iron wall, the need for military power to be, used extensively, repeatedly, until the Arabs, hit themselves in the iron wall and declare surrender. So there's this kind of dialectic, if you want, a relationship between this iron wall and Palestinian Arab attitudes towards Israel as well. And I don't want to go back into this history because it's much more complicated than I'm trying to actually present it. But, in Palestine right now, the situation among Palestinians is, difficult because on the one hand, people are disoriented. They don't know what the future holds. And when you don't know what the future holds, there's a lot of anxiety and fear. And this is coupled or reinforced by a military occupation that is actually a regime of terror. It chooses who to arrest and not to arrest. It chooses who to kill and not to kill. It chooses who it destroys his home and does not destroy his home. And in Gaza, it's, conducting this type of ultimate warfare of annihilation and pressure on the civilian population and the destruction of livelihoods. So at this moment, the Palestinians realize that they need to persevere and they need to have a lot of steadfastness, but at the same time, it comes with a lot of disorientation and perhaps anxiety and panic. This is on one level. The second level of it is, I think, which goes unnoticed, and this is perhaps a surprising element, if you want, because if you're under occupation and you're under this military brutal, the only thing you can think about is that actually this military occupation ends, and then you have this next day or day after which is not the imperial colonial day after that they talk about in Gaza, but the Palestinian imaginary of what a day after occupation and living under a regime of terror would mean. That also the idea that came across in October 7th, that liberation is not some fiction in the distance. No, it's actually possible. And maybe it was only possible for a couple of days. I mean, I'm not here trying to assess the historical veracity of whether October 7th will lead to liberation for certain, because I don't believe in inevitable things. I mean, I'm much more cautious about, trying to put judgments on where this war will end up in. And I think it already presents us with both the nightmare and the dream at once. And perhaps sometimes the nightmare is the dream and the dream is the nightmare. But, my only point is that when October 7th came as this possibility of liberation, people also were afraid of liberation itself, as if at this moment we're not ready to think of the end of an order through which we've already kind of adapted to and accustomed ourselves to, even though we want to end this order, but we have made choices in our life based on this order. We've built our dreams based on this order. We've come to realize who we are as persons and personal identities through this order. So this kind of moment, this opening of an actual, horizon for liberation, has also meant for a lot of Palestinians rethinking who they are and what it means to be Palestinian, what it means to dream of a world without military occupation and without living in a regime of terror. And this is specifically true for people outside of Gaza, because I think people within Gaza, the only thing that they're thinking of is an end of this war immediately. So, and that's what they're looking forward to more than anything else. Because when you're constantly under firepower from air and you're constantly under, a survival mode, it's a different type of thinking that is going on in Gaza. But for people outside of Gaza, there was also a fear of Israel and what it's committing in Gaza being replicated elsewhere, but also a fear of liberation itself as a potential. What would that mean? Who am I? And, I think this is also an element of how people felt, at least since October 7th, around that. And therefore, a lot of the discourse around resistance emanates from that. Emanates from either saying, look, resistance doesn't work, so we should stop to resist. Or it says resistance is the only option because we're defending our life, and we're defending our presence in Palestine, and we're giving ourselves a chance to actually survive a military machine that wants to actually get rid of us and annihilate us. And, in the long term or in the medium run, whether it does it now or in the future, at the end, what we have seen quite clearly is this Israeli desire for annihilating the Palestinian native of Palestine. And that's us. And that there's no option but to resist this military machine. As a result. So, but in many ways, I think still resistance operates on this level of hope. Its existence and persistence for Gaza is giving people hope that the war will end and that the Palestinians will come out still with a lot of pain and with a lot of ruins, but, having at least prevented Israel from achieving everything that it wants to achieve. And the same goes for the Lebanese resistance and other resistance movements in the region. So, there's a confused, disoriented type of mood in Palestine around everything. And that's why the discourse can be at the same time with the resistance and against it, and seeing it as unrealistic and realistic, or thinking, oh, I wish we could go back before October 7th, or people, we should continue and persevere, and people are already declaring whether we are defeated or victorious. So it's a complete haze of a mix, and we should remember, of course, that part of that social discourse is being fed through a psychological warfare that is systematic by a lot of Arab governments and the Israeli, information warfare units that are, operating, whether on social media or through established media operations in the Arab world, and feeding, psychic and ideological assaults against the resistance as part and parcel of its operation. So this is what the picture. I mean, I think, there's no single decisive answer to it. It just goes in different direction, because war is living within uncertainty, war is living within this kind of disorientation.
Yeah, thank you for that. And finally, before we end here, where do you see the events in Lebanon heading? Do you see de-escalation on the horizon, or do you see it going out to a full-blown war?
Well, look, I've learned something about predicting in this war is that those who predict end up looking like fools. So um, I don't see that the war will de-escalate unless one of the actors flinches or is incapable of continuing or decides to retreat. And looking at Israeli strategy at this moment, it's true that it wants a short, intense war, which will not get in Lebanon. And the only option it has is to escalate more and more. And with that, the Lebanese resistance will have to escalate as well. And unless there is some sort of intervention by, Israel's allies, that is, actual and tangible, and uses the leverage that these allies have vis-a-vis Israel, I think that this war will continue to escalate, unfortunately, and not de-escalate. Or it will find this new tempo of, northern Palestine versus Israeli-wide aerial bombardment campaign on this level and continues like that. But I don't see it de-escalating in any significant manner. So it either stays within this tempo or escalates further. But again, as I said before, escalation is not only one step or two steps. There's a lot of steps before you see a much more decisive, open form of warfare where everything is used against, each actor uses everything that it has against the other.
Well, Abboud, thank you for joining the Mondo Wise podcast, and thank you for your time. I really enjoyed the conversation.
Thank you, Khadir.
That's our show. Mondo Weiss is a nonprofit publication with no paywalls. If you would like to support our work, please go to mondoweiss.net/donate. Please leave a rating and review to help other listeners find the show. Subscribe to one of our free email newsletters so you can stay up to date on events in Palestine and related politics here in the U.S. and around the world. Finally, if you have any more feedback, send me an email at dave@mondoweiss.net. Thanks for listening. We'll be back soon with a new episode.